Good to go? All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on this panel. My name is Stephen Harrington. I'm the engagement lead for the JP Morgan Chase Institute and Policy Center, respectively the firm's think tank and public policy impact group. So together we work on economic policy issues, including housing, which is very near and dear to my heart, labor markets, and financial health. Our work and our team really align with the firm's existing inclusive growth efforts, including the $30 billion end of 2025 commitment to advance economic growth in the inclusive communities that we serve. So I'm really excited to moderate this panel with these experts, and we'll talk about best practices on meeting with diverse communities, messaging, building strong coalitions, and targeted advocacy. I'll allow each of the panelists from closest to furthest a couple minutes to introduce themselves, and then we'll go into questions.
Good afternoon. I'm from Los Angeles, so it might be still morning.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. It's a good afternoon.
Again, my name is Hei Pinim. I run a nonprofit called Faith and Community Empowerment this year. We celebrate 20 years of service. A little bit of my story, I grew up as a pastor's kid, and my parents ended up really becoming unpaid social workers, which is what a lot of faith leaders end up becoming and doing. And I always had a desire, could there be a better way? And part of my journey is that I got to know a very prominent African-American church called First AME Los Angeles, and I saw a model where the faith community, when they partner with the broader community, they could have so much more impact. A lot of miracles happened along the way. Our organization formed. We've had over 800 plus partners from White House to Fortune 500 companies, and housing and home ownership was definitely one of our first go-to and partners as well. Part of my journey and story is that when we first convened our national event, we put ourselves on the map as the Korean Asian community. But after the fact, when we tried to pursue opportunities, I learned quickly there was no line to stand in as an Asian American in this country. And so to this day, every panel, every session, I am always battling, combating the model minority myth that says that Asians are white adjacent. I think for us, that model, that myth, hurts us in two ways. It hurts us in terms of the lack of investments that come to our community. It also hurts us in terms of lack of solidarity with other communities of color. So we're kind of in a rock and a hard place of a no man's land, no white privilege, no solidarity, no resources. And so again, I'm really honored to have been invited, and I'd like to share a little bit more on this journey as well.
Thank you, Hyphen. I am also gonna, I'm gonna one-up you. It's also morning for me, but at the same time, I'm coming from San Diego, California, and have slept 0 hours. So yes. As long as I am lowering the threshold, the expectations, as long as I'm coherent, I'm winning today. So
I feel you. Same red eye, probably.
I am a fellow with the UC Berkeley Turner Center for Housing Innovation and run a consulting firm called Mariposa Strategies that focuses on bridging the homeownership gaps and the wealth gaps among communities of color. Prior to this work, I was the Executive Vice President for Policy and Advocacy at the National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals, where I ran and created the policy department and research department for the organization. I also spent a long time here in DC, so it's home in a way. Worked for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau for about 6 years, and the White House under President Obama before that. So I am excited to have this conversation. There's nothing that I enjoy more or that I think is more important than working in coalition with these communities up on stage. So excited to dive into this conversation.
Ampetu kile chantema washtea na na pechu zapelo lokoi chaje wakio ambli macha. Hello, good day. I greet each of you with a handshake and a good heart. My Lakota name is Eagle Thunder. The name that was given at my birth is Bill Peacock, and I represent the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe in north central South Dakota. I work in the DC area for the National American Indian Housing Council. I'm the deputy director, and NEHC is a membership organization comprised of Indian housing authorities nationwide, all of whom are generally funded by Indian Housing Block Grant from HUD under the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act of 1996. NEHC has been around since 1974, serving tribes, and we put on 3 annual events, annual conference, a legal symposium, and just last week our annual legislative conference. We do a lot of training and technical assistance for the housing authorities, and obviously we do a good amount of advocacy on the Hill for housing policy aimed at Indian country. Thank you.
So, of course, they put me next to that beautiful introduction. And so now I have to introduce myself. So I'm Keisha Danerine. I am an immigrant from Trinidad and Tobago, so very proud to be a West Indian. I'm currently the National Director of Opportunity, which is inclusive economy work and race and justice for the NAACP. And so my platform is to focus on how we continue to increase inclusive activities to progress Black community, and how we continue to hold accountable racist systems, dismantle and disrupt those systems for race and justice. And so I'm really happy to be here, and great to be with you all today.
Great. So we all know that data and evidence are really at the core of anything we do in terms of messaging, advocacy, how we interact and advance our priorities with policymakers. I'd love to hear more from the panelists, starting with Hapen, really about how evidence serves you and how evidence has actually also been sometimes a hindrance, or data collection has been a hindrance to your efforts.
Thank you for that question. So again, under the umbrella of AAPI, there's over 50 groups. We don't share borders, language, or culture, and yet they throw everyone in the kitchen sink. And actually that group consists of also 100 languages. It is really rare that, like, I'm here on this panel. Usually we're not on stage. We're not on the talking points or the PowerPoints. And so it's very easy, they say, when you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. And if and when they choose to include the AAPI community, again, when it's grouped together, it looks like we're white adjacent in terms of privilege. But if you actually disaggregate the data, you will see a lot of interesting information. So since this is about housing, homeownership is one. And some of you have actually on your desk this sheet of paper. I had to work hard to get this aggregated data, right? And you'll see here, in yellow, if they choose to include the AAPI data, that AAPI homeownership rate is at 61% compared to the white at 66%. And Latino 48, Black at 42. So based on that, you would think, wow, Asians are doing well. No need to make investments, right? But what actually, though, when you disaggregate, you'll see I'm Korean American. Korean and actually Black homeownership rate is the same. But there's 7 other API subgroups below both Black and Korean homeownership rate, and 12 below the Hispanic 48% homeownership rate. And so I see a lot of equity initiatives, but usually it does not include the API community. And so it's interesting because we have been told as a community that we are doing well, even though individually we may be suffering, we still are surprised. And so when I show this data to the community, right, it's not just the non-Asian families or communities that are surprised, it's the Asians themselves. Even if individually they're suffering, again, the message out there as such. And so for us, as a group, we worked and advocated successfully through a group called CRC for the HMDA data to be disaggregated. So that is finally available. But again, our experience as an Asian American in this country is that we continue to be excluded, erased, and many times demonized. And so that has been our fight. we need those data points that at least will, because otherwise I don't think we have a fighting chance. They just go, oh, well, you're the exception. And it's only when we share the data point that we somehow seem to get people's attention. So data, as you say, could be used for, but it could be also used against. And so I really want to advocate for policymakers and decision makers when you're looking at data to ask, where are the disaggregated data, definitely for the API community, but to also say, gosh, is this reflective, right? And to push further for more questions. One last piece. Again, a lot of businesses are funded through home equity lines, at least for communities of color. And I want to say that during the pandemic, the API community was, again, impacted, China virus, coronavirus, hate virus, et cetera. And so you'll see here, this is a study, 2022, by the Federal Reserve. And it says which group fared the poorest in terms of their financial condition. And you'll see here, again, surprising. It's surprising for me too, right? That Asians is at 39%. That's what percent are in the poorest financial condition. The next group is Black at 36, Hispanic 28, and then white 17%. So again, there is this place for solidarity that I think we could all combine our voices and forces, right? To really, again, make the pie bigger for all of us.
Mm-hmm. Keisha, you talk often about the use of census data and language to do fund allocations, and then I'll open it up a bit. Can you talk more about how the NAACP has used data and evidence to advance their public policy initiatives?
So I think there's a couple things about data that I want to kind of bring to the forefront, and then I'll let you all know about what the NAACP is doing and how we look at mapping and data to really emphasize our policy work. But I think when it comes to Black and brown community, there is such a significant amount of data, and the question for me that I continue to ask is how much more data do we need to show disproportionality, because it exists.
Yeah.
And so that's a conversation piece that I continue to have around, are we gonna put out, and it's not us, I mean in the consensus, are we gonna put out another report with a negative narrative that pinpoints the things happening against Black community, against brown community? And so although I think data brings a great wealth of knowledge in the ways that you approach a strategy or approach a policy and advocacy component, it also counts against a population of people that you're trying to also uplift and or provide resources to. So keep that in mind when we think about data. So the NAACP has partnerships with several agencies. So one, we have the Black Index report that we did alongside Brookings, which then talks about where the status of Black people exists today in this country, from generational wealth to bridging racial wealth divide to conversations about housing, including about health data. So we also know there's a disproportionality around life expectancy from Black and brown people to white people in this country. And how does that frame our work? So, well, Brookings is one. We also have a mapping relationship with Esri. If you guys are familiar with Esri, they're out of California, and they provide significant mapping data. Because what we want to know is, we understand that there is a difference and a disconnect, but we also want to map traditional areas, urban areas, where funds have gone, where capital has been deployed, where housing benefits have existed, has that progressed, those types of things. So mapping is a big tool that we use. And we also have just relationships in general that we have had long-term with different grants that the NAACP has received to kind of vet out some of these things. So how do we use data in a way that we can change narrative? Because storytelling and narrative makes all the difference. And so what we look at and how we use that data is around the policy work and the strategies that we use to both help our state conference leaders and how we advance federal policy. So if we understand, and I say this because we are the oldest and largest civil rights social justice organizations in the United States, right? So we have an extreme amount of prominent background to our work, 114 years. People come to us, and I mean all people, all walks of life come to us wanting to solve a problem, and we cannot be all things to everybody. There's just no way to solve all the world's problems. And so we have to use that data to be very specific on how we advance an agenda. So example, student debt, big campaign for us, right? Our President Johnson talked along President Biden, fighting equity in the student debt conversation. We have big policies on the way that gun control and police reform look. Why? Because we understand that the data tells us that Black people are more likely to die from gun violence, and we have, of course, a trail of record a way police brutality works within Black communities. So this is also about housing, so I'm gonna keep it housing. We understand that redlining, particularly around how Black communities were formed, lack of resources, and also discrimination in housing has affected generational wealth and bridging the racial wealth divide. So those are the top policies that we work on because now we've got this data. But I encourage you all to use data to set agenda. But remember, sometimes too much data builds a negative narrative and it doesn't really help you form or really articulate a positive storytelling that you need to kind of get your policy across. So,
Norena, you've worked at NARAP, you did the Hispanic Homeownership Report, CFPB. Love to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, so I'm going to agree with the previous two speakers. First of all, yes, how much more data do we need to show that there is disproportionality? But on the disaggregation of data, I've become really interested in that when it comes to the Latino community. A couple of years ago for the State of Hispanic Homeownership Report, I disaggregated the data among the Latino community. And in NARAP, you'll see if you're at the Trade Association conference, you will have people from every country of origin in the Latin American diaspora. And there is a unison. There is a unison to the fact that the Latino community does speak the same language. There is a thread in terms of a similar culture that I think weaves the diaspora, but the realities are very different. Mm-hmm. And I think that was, I don't have this graph in front of you like Hayapin. I wasn't as prepared as Hayapin was. But this disaggregation of data is actually really interesting because then it allows us to think about what are we trying to solve for, right? Mm-hmm. And if you look at this, the Latino homeownership rate right now is about 48.6, I believe. And so if we look at that as kind of the threshold, the Argentinian population has the highest homeownership rate among the Latino diaspora at 57.2%. The lowest homeownership rate is among the Honduran population, which is 27.3%. So that's a huge difference. So disaggregating this data, we understand that, look, if we're going to talk about race and the role that race plays in the homeownership rates, the Argentinian and the Chilean community are the most homogeneous in terms of they tend to be the most European ancestry or pure European ancestry blood in terms of the Latino diaspora. They have the highest Latino homeownership rate in the country. When you look at the Honduran, Dominican, Guatemalan population, they have the lowest homeownership rate. If we're going to look at immigration and migration patterns, the Mexican population is the largest Latino population in the country. They have a 51.2%. But you also have to think about the fact that the Mexican population has been here the longest. I mean, there's the whole, we forget that the whole Southwest used to be Mexico, you know, the border across them. So it's the largest, but also, you know, there's been many generations with the opportunity to build generational wealth. Although, you know, when it comes to redlining, being Mexican was bottom of the list in terms of how you were rated in terms of a community. But if you look at migration patterns, the Honduran, Guatemalan populations, they are the newest group to migrate into the United States. So they've been here for the least amount of time, which would also account for why those homeownership rates are so low. But also, where are these communities located also plays a big role. The Dominican population is the second lowest at 27.4%. they're concentrated in New York that has the lowest homeownership rate in the country. So I think understanding the nuances really helps to understand what story are we solving for, because there are white Latinos and there are indigenous Latinos and there are black Latinos. So there are, the Latino diaspora is not a race, it is an ethnicity. So there are a lot of nuances that are weaved depending on which community you're talking about, and the needs are different. So programmatically, I think it's a very interesting perspective to think about in terms of what you're trying to solve for.
Bill, would love to hear your thoughts, particularly as Native Americans are also seen as one monolithic group, but have been, sovereign nations and different groups entirely.
Well, I think one of the things Indian country needs to get better at is collecting data and telling their story. I don't think we always do that to a degree that is necessary in order for us to, realize, I'll just say the American dream. All right, we're here to talk about home ownership. I think a lot of that has to do with the diversity of tribes and the fact that there are distinctive linguistic groups, there are differences in culture and governance, and I think in Indian country a lot of this has to do with a basic distrust of mainstream ideas about who we are and what we experience as people of color. Generations and perhaps centuries of dishonorable dealings, I'll put it that way, leave Indian country feeling like second-class citizens, certainly third world type of communities. But I agree with the panel that collection of data, telling a story, trying to use that story to get a point across, whether it be about home ownership, whether it be about infrastructure or any social problems that we experience, not just in Indian country, but as people of color in general, needs to improve, I guess.
I also want to add that I'm not sure if I even said the name of our organization. It's called Faith and Community Empowerment FACE. We say we strive to bring the face of God through service and lift those who are faceless. One of the other areas that we do work in is around capacity building capacity of faith and other nonprofit leaders to be successful in the community development engagement space. And we share a lot of our knowledge and resource. And so one group that we have worked with is the African immigrant community. So that's, again, another subgroup that may not get the same kind of love and attention when they focus on the immigrant community as well. So again, we've learned, if you break out even the African American community, there's nuances of, where people are from as well.
Definitely. Keisha's Trinidadian, my mother's Trinidadian.
Yes.
It's very different from my father.
Did she go to Carnival, Trini?
Yes, she did. Yes, she did. She left me behind. I was very upset. But very different experience, though similar from that of my father, who is a descendant of American slavery. So definitely those differences and similarities are important for coalition building and messaging and how we move things forward. In terms of really community engagement, I want to talk more about making sure that the communities that we work in, that we serve, really have a good understanding of not only the policy, but the products that can help them gain homeownership, that can be a part of building sustainable, affordable communities. And so I'll actually start with Keisha this time, really talking about how do we work closely with those communities? How do we build trust and disseminate information so that they are well-informed and can take control of their own destiny?
Okay, so that's a really great question, but it's also a loaded question. And I'm looking at Erica in the back because when we actually prepped for this conversation, this question actually struck me because what I said was, I think we need to remind the audience that the housing system in this country is embedded in racism and was created on racist standard, right? And so there's a distinct community, and I think all of us here represent some of that community, may not be all, but some, that do not trust housing systems, financial institutions, or cooperatives, or anything that brings that type of what they consider product-based solution, because in our history in this country, they were not in favor of or continue to provide the right and fair solutions for people of color. And so I think the number one thing in this conversation is not just about product solution. I think we have enough, I don't necessarily agree the products are sometimes fair, but we have enough product solution in the sense of federally backed loans, unregulated loan funds, CDFIs, all the things. I think the biggest conversation piece that I think any of us, and I don't want to speak for my other panelists, but is trust. Trust building is number one when it comes to finding solution that is equitable for the community that you're diving into and serving. And we all know that each community is very different, and we've all brought that up from a data perspective. Communities in this country are built on culture, ethnicity, passion, love, all the things. And so you may come against, let's just say a West Indian community is my friend over there, and it may be considered a brown or black community, but then you may have a true redlined black community. Louisville, I'm from Louisville, Kentucky, West Louisville, parts of Chicago, Harlem, New York. I mean, we can, parts of Baltimore, we can go down the list of what redlining communities look like. And then we understand that there was a true significant disinvestment in those communities on purpose. Mm-hmm. Those communities, by the way, over the course of our history have suffered the most blood massacres across the nation because they were prevented from striving. Detroit 67, Bloody Sun, we can go down the list again. And so what I want to recognize is all of that cannot be erased. Some people may try to erase critical race theory. Guess what? It exists. And so what we have to do first and foremost is build trust. You cannot push a product or you cannot push a solution if the community does not understand your intentions. Oh, and by the way, they don't want to be saved. They want to be supported. Those are two different things. And so how we approach trust, how we continue to educate and provide resources, and how we continue to, and I'll say it again in this section, change the negative narrative. That's what's going to build your base of foundation in order to go in and to provide amazing services, whether it be nonprofit, whether it be from realtor, all of those people who are advocating for great work. They can't do great work if there's no trust. So I just want to kind of bring that up in the sense of, yes, there's product and there's good product. Could they be changed? Yes. But in order for people to understand your intentions, there's got to be a trust-based factor. And I think not we on this panel, but I do think there's an overlook of that when it comes to communities of color. So that's kind of the start of the question. Pass it to someone else.
Hey, Penn, you talked a little bit about, in previous conversations, the role of engaging with the media. And I see that as a connection to Keisha's point of trust building, right? Authentic communication in communities so that they trust the products, the policies, et cetera, and are engaged with it and help build that financial stability, which is homeownership. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. So I'm in many of these type of meetings, and as mentioned, for the API community, because of the model minority myth, there's very few allocations of funding. So I say, here's a no-cost solution. Can you add a list of ethnic media to your distribution list? Your ethnic media will do the heavy lifting of providing the translation, right? And again, for many communities, especially for the Asian community, that number changes here, by a few percentage every year, but a good 65, 70% are still foreign-born, and they have limited English skills. Not by choice. Again, this country's legislation prevented the bulk of most Asians from coming into this country until the 1965 Immigration Act. So again, the ethnic media is one powerful way, easy, no-cost way to do so. I would say also the faith organizations are another place where if you were to engage, is very cost effective in being able to reach communities that normally mainstream media will never reach. I do want to say that, again, the Asian community is perceived as one that is highly sensitive to cultural shame. And I want to say yes and no. At the end of the day, we're all people. Perhaps in our back home country, there weren't resources. And what I've seen is that human beings, we have a heart, right? And if someone has a problem, it hurts us, right? And if there is no solution, then you don't want to continue hurting. And so our tendency then is to shut them out. What I've learned is that if there are solutions, then the shame factor disappears. So I remember even around foreclosure, I was afraid, like when we say, hey, we're going to have a foreclosure prevention fair, will people even show up? But what we decided to do was basically show success stories. And at the end, we had very limited time, so we just put one mic literally like in front, right? And we asked, do you have any questions? You know what? There was a line of people divulging their financial challenges and situations. And so again, I think the idea of the word building trust is helping people to see that there are solutions. And so for me, I am about the down payment assistance products. So there isn't enough, but if there are more of those tools, right, where those gaps are, to help establish or restore equity for all the communities of color who have been erased, excluded from this country's wealth building investment through home ownership. I think that it can help. For the one last piece, for the Asian community, again, there's a high rate of self-employment. Again, not because of aspirations, but because of lack of options, that they end up being self-employed. Well, a lot of the down payment assistance products are not that friendly to self-employed individuals. Again, they're having limited income, so they're going to report on their tax return. They're going to use all the tax deductions or whatever method, right, to show low income. But when it comes to actually buying a home, well, you're now screwed because you show such little income that they're not going to give you enough of a loan to buy a home. So I'm just giving examples, again, of the nuances of that. But bottom line, trust for particularly the Asian community is that you actually see us. You're investing in the ethnic media. You're putting investment. You're showing up in our community. Because really, it's really rare that you ever, whoever they are, ever show up in our community that it becomes big news. Right? And so that shows for us that we just continue to be excluded and erased.
Please.
I think being in DC for a while I think there's an element if we get disconnected from how local communities work one way or another. And I remember when I wanted to leave DC, I was really hungry to get really ingrained into a city, into a community, and I've been able to do that in California and San Diego region, and it just really underscores how critical those local nonprofit organizations are in terms of reaching communities. And because they already have that trust, because they've been around for very long, you can't come in, national organizations can't come into communities and be the savior because it's not going to work. It has to be within the grassroots organizations that are on the ground in order for that trust to exist, because there is I think that there is a starting point of distrust for anything that comes in. I do want to make a note about media. I think one of the biggest mistakes that people make when they think about outreaching to the Latino community is to say, well, we got to do more Spanish media. It is a very important tool, but when I said that at NAREP, or the Latino community, there's a common language, I didn't mean Spanish. the common language among the Latino community is Spanglish. And the majority of Latinos, and if you look at the median age of Latinos in the US, it's 30, very young population. The majority of the population is, they're Gen Zers, millennial. I'm a millennial, I'm an old millennial now, I'm middle-aged. But if you think about that, I think ads are catching on to that. I get targeted all the time on Netflix now with Latino families speaking English with a little bit of Spanish in it, but that's how we talk. And I think that, it's only my parents' generation that watches the Spanish language media now. So I think we automatically think that, and we forget what the Latino community actually looks like and what they actually act like in the US. Much to the chagrin of my father, who has, thank God, taught me Spanish, and I speak really good Spanish, but unfortunately, like it happens in our communities, we lose our languages.
Mm-hmm.
Bill?
I'm sorry, could you ask that question again?
Sure.
I got lost in the conversation.
It was a wonderful conversation so far. Really, what avenues do you think work best to connect your community and these communities on stage with the policies and products that would benefit them the most?
Connecting the community. I started out my career in housing as a college dropout. And I got involved with Housing Assistance Council. They came to Cheyenne River and they said, we have some grant money from Northwest Area Foundation and we'd like to help you hire a tribal member to package rural development 502 and 504 program products. Here we go with that word products again. And I think a lot of the impetus for that was they recognized that in order to bring change to the community, and starting with these 4 Native communities, including my community, they needed a community member to be trained and to help people engage in these products. And because, again, it goes back to that distrust.
Yeah.
I mean, for Native people, it's all stolen land, okay? It was stolen from us. And that's the way we see it. And we've been dehumanized. We've had genocide committed against us. Again, it goes back to that basic distrust. So when organizations come to our communities, if you're just going to come into the community and try to save us, that's not going to work, right? So their idea was to hire a tribal member to help people, Native people, apply for these programs. You get a home loan, you get a home repair loan. Later came down payment assistance, which there's never enough of. But it's really hard to get that trust. And for us, leave the media out of the question. There is no media. We're invisible, we're unseen, we're unheard. I always talk to people, because I was there every weekend. I had a day job, but I was at Standing Rock from August until December during the pipeline protests in 2016. And that was the most media attention we got in decades. Probably since the early 70s, when the American Indian movement was doing things like taking over the Bureau of Indian Affairs in DC, or the Custer County Courthouse in Custer, South Dakota, or occupying the site of the Wounded Knee Massacre, and that kind of stuff back in the 70s. So I think it's real hard for us to engage in light of all of that history. I get a little bit emotional, you guys, talking about this stuff, and I apologize, but this is my people, These are our experiences, and they're unique. Although there are a lot of similarities to all of our experience, they are quite unique. I don't know how many people watch Yellowstone. You raise your hand. How about 1923? Have you gotten to see that? You know, that's some of our history right there. You know, a couple of years ago, they talked about finding hundreds, if not thousands, of Native children buried on the sites of residential schools and boarding schools. And if you watched 1923, you get a taste of that, don't you? It's horrific. And it's the truth. And it makes me really angry to watch, and it makes me, and that comes from hurt. That anger comes from my hurt. To realize that happened to our people. I'm getting a little bit off subject here, but I'm trying to give you some of my perspective on why things are the way they are in Indian country. So,
But what I hear from this really, Bill, is authentic, right, individualized, people from the community helping to make those connections, right?
exactly.
Right.
And we're talking about trust has come up on several different points on this. That's a way to build trust, authentically engaging partnerships with folks in the community, letting them lead and having partnerships with them so that people feel like they're being represented. Not only feel, but they are being represented, they're being heard, and they can engage on, what self-determination looks like for them.
And I just want to add to that too. I think that you brought up a great point about there's not enough
Yeah.
about down payment assistance. And I think that needs to be just elevated a second on the policy side. So we talked a lot about community and product, but what we didn't touch on, is policy. So as advocates in the work that we do, there's only so much, as I mentioned before, that one organization can take on at one time or one person can take on at one time. So we know, right, we know that the standard of underwriting and the standard of credit is discriminatory in this country. We know it. We understand it and we know it. And so from a policy perspective, it is so important that you understand the policies that are happening both federally and in your state that impact these housing conversations, because you can Band-Aid it, but it's still broken. And the only way to actively change that vicious cycle is for policies, your hierarchy and power structure, and your policies to change. And that's the only way you're going to have more opportunity for down payment assistance. Or we could take away student debt that is crippling first-time home buyers because of the amount of debt-to-income ratio. That's a problem. So we tell our young kids, go to school, get an education. Oh, and by the way, there's disproportionality because you can't have generational wealth, right? So those are the things. I'm kind of nitpicking, but those are overall the things that we need to focus on and change in these conversations so we can have equitable outcomes. And I think that's important from a state and federal perspective. I also think from a housing perspective, we're in a market right now that's just crazy. If you know a person who's a mortgage lender, please pray for them.
Yeah.
Because with the inflation of housing and real estate, pray for them, because with the inflation of housing, the increase in interest rates, again, these predatory lines that, back into kind of they're regulatory, but they're also predatory. All the things are counting up against people that we want to ultimately have generational wealth and buy a home. And so those policies and the fight to break this system that's ultimately built, again, on racism is the only way we're going to change it. It's not, partnerships are one thing and it's helpful, but that's not going to break and change the system. It's the policy. So you guys have to be really boisterous with that and use your local units. Use the NAACP, use National Urban League or your local urban league. Use those housing conversations. I love unregulated loan funds. They're great. Cooperatives, seek them out and ask them what policies that they're fighting for, and then use your voice to elevate that policy So then folks can have an equitable housing system, because the equitable housing system does not exist with the current underwriting and the current credit guidelines today. I'm not taking over, but I just want to ask, by a show of hands, how many of you have experienced some type of or heard from someone a discriminatory practice in buying a home or refinancing? Yeah, okay, so that's the problem. And we've just now shown the problem, and so now we've got to figure out a way to fix the problem.
Since she was talking about policy, I find that one of the most effective successes have been where we had a inside champion within the institution, whether it's in government or corporate America or whatever, who would give us some insight of what is going on within that institution, but they themselves cannot be the voice of the community, right? And so we as community organizations would be the one that will be mobilizing and have the talking points, but really based on insights of what's happening within the institution. So I just want to put out there, if you are within the institution, we would welcome opportunity as community organizations to work hand in hand to bring about change that you might not be able to do alone. I do want to say around discrimination, again, I'm always surprised, even though, again, I'm the one in this space, but homeownership, discrimination rate, rental homeownership, rental discrimination rate, Asians are right there. Actually, homeownership is higher than anyone else. Again, I'm equally surprised, right? So those are the realities for our community. And so again, I welcome opportunities to be included as a community in all these discussions.
Nareda, we've worked together actually on coalition building, and it's such a great segue from policy into coalition building, really, and you have been a part of that with other advocates, that with the business community, that with researchers. Can you share some about how to influence policy making through those like strong, well-oiled coalitions? So you may have someone on the inside, but you're also pressuring from all different sides, and there's create an echo chamber of conversation that really just can't be ignored.
Absolutely. I do want to first start the conversation with thanking Bill for sharing authentically why it is that you do the work that you do. And your voice is so powerful in grounding our work in the passion behind and the pain behind this work that we do. And if we're going to work in coalitions, starting our coalitions with hearing from each other about what drives one another and those pains and those are the things that are going to connect us in the struggle and that are connect us in the coalition. But again, if we're dealing, this is why it's important that that the folks who have experienced these issues to be the leading voices also within coalitions, because I think we all have experiences of being ignored or being silenced or erased from conversations. So I think Bill showed us how coalitions are built, given what you shared earlier. But policy making always involves losses. Someone is going to lose something. And a failure to involve individuals that are going to incur losses means that we're not going to get to an effective policy solution that is going to have longevity. I've had the privilege of participating in some that Ms. Chrissy Johnson here has done a really fantastic job, for example, of bringing groups together, ranging from industry, ranging from consumer groups, ranging from civil rights organizations, in order to come together to create a solution where all voices are heard and we're able to account for unintended consequences. And I think that's critical. But again, I think if we forget a lot of the times, and I work on this, if we forget that in order to really make a difference, we have to we have to work with adversaries. You know, we have to work and really understand what it is that they're losing, and understand their pain. And sometimes as a person of color, that's a hard thing to think about sometimes. But that's when, I mean, that's the very core of adaptive leadership. You know, that's the very core of how the civil rights movement was successful. You know, it's because you know, the work was brought back to you know, white communities, and by showcasing, you know, the discrepancy between what we thought about ourselves as a country and what was actually happening on the ground, and using those sorts of strategies. So I just, when we're thinking about coalitions, I think that is, I think that's the only way to get anything done. So we're working together. We're working as a broad group of folks, and together we're stronger.
And I think you bring up such a great point that we often put politics in policy.
Yeah.
You all, these are bipartisan conversations. People need housing.
Yeah.
They need a place to live. People need to feel safe in the streets they walk in, whether it be by violence and crime and gun, or by police. Regardless of the problem, they need to feel safe. They need to have affordable resources. They need food access, right? So these are not conversations, right? These are not conversations, to your point, that have to do with a political agenda. These are bipartisan conversations that are a need and necessity for the human rights of people. We're talking about human rights. And I think that sometimes, to that point, gets in the way of, I gotta pick a side, or I have to pick a color.
Yeah.
This is not about side and color. This is about people dying on the streets, and this is about homeless people not having a place to put their head. That's a problem. This is about people not having food.
I also think that it is about humanity, but actually, at the end of the day, someone else's problem becomes all our problems too. So there is a bigger gain. And I think over the years, I mean, my default is to be efficient, at least in the short term, or cost effective. But I've learned over the years in my experience in the community that sometimes actually being cost effective in the short run could bring unintended huge losses on the back end. So, you know, policies like housing first, right? Or other programs, again, I've learned over time to put a pause button on my natural default to go, okay, this is most cost effective, and not worry about other people's priorities. But again, listening to one another and at all different places, that how can we create policy that creates transparency as well as recognition for all communities that there's a greater win for all of us as well.
Excellent. Bill, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was thinking about when Hack came to Cheyenne River with this grant, and you know, out of that grew my interest. I had dropped out of college because of money. I was working for the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe as a property and supply director, basically facilities management. And yeah, I went to a couple of conferences and heard them talk about all these other resources besides. Back then, it was 37 Housing Act, was the pile of money that Indian housing authorities were served by. This is just before the House was enacted. And you know, they talked about how you could use a nonprofit to access all these resources. And I remember saying to myself, I wonder why nobody back home, because housing need is so great, why nobody back home is taking advantage of some of these programs, why somebody doesn't start a nonprofit. And I didn't know at the time, but number one, I said, well, why don't you do it? So I undertook it. And for 12 years, I was the founder and executive director of OT Kaha on Cheyenne River in Eagle Butte, South Dakota. We built 6 LIHTC projects. We got about 200 people assistance with down payment assistance with getting Section 184 loans, couple $1 million worth of 502 loans, probably close to $1 million in 504. But I didn't know a lot about this stuff, you guys. Again, perhaps a college dropout, but certainly no dummy. And to undertake that, I had to kind of, not knowing at the time, build a coalition. I always said, I don't know what I'm doing really, but I know a lot of people, and they know they each have a piece of the puzzle I need to put together in order to pull this off. And so I just started calling on my network, different people I knew that might know something about nonprofits or housing or whatever I needed to know. And that coalition building, I'll say, made it successful. There came a point in 2006 when the tribe came to me and said, we're at capacity on our water and sewer system. We need about $268 million in order to increase the water lines and build a new treatment facility. We get our water from the Missouri River. Our south border, or rather our north border, is Standing Rock's southern border. So we get our water from that same river. But I didn't know it at the time, but certainly now I know the importance of coalition building. Just in the last 10 years, some of the tribes and some of the native CDFIs have kind of started an informal organization that is becoming more formal as we speak. They're currently trying to hire an executive director. But the South Dakota Native Homeownership Coalition was loosely formed about 10 years ago, and they meet several times a year. But it's Indian housing authorities. I want to say what I read was 72 stakeholders in the state of South Dakota and federal partners, state, federal, private partners, in addition to tribes, CDFIs, South Dakota Housing Development Authority, the State Housing Finance Agency, et cetera. So certainly I recognize the importance of coalition building. The squeaky wheel gets greased, and the more voices making noise,
Amen to that.
the squeakier you are.
Amen to
Yep.
that.
So we have 3 minutes left, and it doesn't really do this question justice, but in the spirit of the squeaky wheel gets the most noise, what are each of your top squeaky wheels that the people here and online should think about as they go throughout their day and their work? And I can start from, Bill, do you want to start?
You're the moderator.
All right, we'll start from closest to further.
Okay. So again, the disaggregation of API data and inclusion, just kind of on a side note, we are also doing affordable housing. So if you're in that space, churches have land.
Yeah.
And most churches are not aware that if they have the right qualified land, that with zero out of pocket, they could build multi-million-dollar affordable housing units. There's no transparency in terms of what they can ask for, what they can get. And so that is something that we have worked on. Last October, we had 200 faith leaders, quite successful, and we're on this path. But I just want to also advocate that faith organizations can be part of this nation's a solution to our current problem on homelessness.
I would, on top of the interest rates that we were talking about earlier, and we have, the massive underproduction of housing. We have a housing supply crisis, and that requires zoning reform, and that is really difficult to do. And so that is at the core, requires coalition work, and it also requires that the voices of communities who have been impacted by redlining, by displacement, by what revitalization of communities used to mean, all of the pains associated with it, those people need to be a part of these conversations because they're the most impacted and they're the most, and there's that pain associated with it. So zoning reform, definitely a very, very difficult thing that we got to do, and we got to do it in coalition, and we need to ensure that all the right voices are a part of that coalition.
Probably my wheel I need to have heard, I guess, is in regards to promotion of home ownership in Indian country. It always seems like the focus is on just getting them the house, doing whatever you can, whether it's helping them figure out their loan to debt ratio, having down payment, closing cost assistance money. But it doesn't seem to me that people are set up for long-term success. Generation upon generation, 4, 5 generations of renters, most of these Native people are. And they don't know just the basic things you need to know. Number one, nobody teaches anybody, and they don't have their father never set the example for them because he was a renter, and so was his father, and so was his father, right? So nobody teaches anybody about home maintenance and how to maintain that home once you get it. And that is key to success. The other thing is, like I've said, everybody wants to subsidize down payment, closing costs. But perhaps the more beneficial approach would be to subsidize interest, which has more of an impact over long term on whether a homeowner is successful. So if you start out at a place where you've got a high interest rate, and we've seen those go up recently, although we've seen them go down for years. Now that they're going back up, who knows what's going to happen? But you know, that impacts greater how much you pay per month. And so, and especially given the economics of Indian country and the economics on the reservation, the lack of jobs, et cetera, even if you can get to a place where you can enjoy home ownership, the next administration comes in, got a new tribal chairman, you get terminated because you didn't support him in his election, and now you're out of a job, you know? And there's not a lot of jobs to be had in Indian country. So I guess, like, keep it short, that's my squeaky wheel, is finding new ways to make successful homeowners.
So I'll make this super quick. I have a national platform, and so my goal is to really focus on policy, on how to change the system. But let me also say this. We can't expect people of color, brown and black people, cannot expect to sit at a table that was not built for them. So guess what? I'm going to build my own table. And everybody's welcome to sit at it. And that's my focus for the next year, is how do we break credit systems? How do we hold accountable financial institutions and the products they push out? How do we push federal dollars back into communities that need for down payment assistance and opportunities for affordable housing? How do we hold, you know, the U.S. Treasury accountable to CDFI and unregulated loan fund dollars? There's about an accountability. And what I would tell you all is, if you're not sitting at a table, go build your own. Mm-hmm. Because not every table was made for you, and you shouldn't have to scooch a seat in. Go build your own table. You'll be more successful that way. So I wish you guys all the luck in dismantling a very racist system for the betterment of everybody to have a home at the end of the day that they can call theirs, pass on to their children, and have a bed to put their heads on. And that's it.
Well, please join me in congratulating this amazing panel. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
And have the great rest of your afternoon. Be clear this time.
Thank you.